What is winter like in a modern city? You're sitting in a warm apartment, watching your favorite TV show, while snow falls quietly outside the window. If you suddenly get hungry, you just open the fridge or order delivery. It sounds like an ordinary evening, one we've all long since grown accustomed to. But now, let's rewind time 700 years, straight to the year 1315. Spoiler alert, your food delivery won't arrive, because the courier has most likely already been eaten by wolves in the forest. Most people think the Middle Ages were all about knights in shining armor and beautiful castles, but the reality was much more like a gritty survival documentary. The Great Famine of 1315 was a true catastrophe that changed Europe forever. It was a time when a simple piece of stale bread was worth more than a human life. Do you think you could easily survive a single winter under those conditions? Believe me, your chances would be zero, and now I'll explain exactly why. It all began when it started raining in the spring of 1315. That doesn't sound very scary, since spring rains are a perfectly normal occurrence in Europe. The problem was that this rain simply refused to stop. It rained for weeks, then months, turning roads into impassable rivers of liquid mud. Modern meteorologists attribute such anomalies to major climate shifts, but medieval peasants simply looked up at the sky and thought the end of the world had come. To understand the scale of the problem, you need to remember how the economy worked back then. There were simply no supermarkets with stockpiles of canned goods in case of an apocalypse. People were completely dependent on what they could grow in their fields during a single short season. Now imagine that your fields have turned into a giant, cold swamp. The grain began to rot right in the ground, without even having a chance to sprout properly. Your annual budget was literally dissolving in water right before your eyes. Because of the constant dampness, the farmers couldn't even plough the heavy soil properly. Huge ploughs got stuck in the mud so deep that even strong oxen couldn't pull them out. Speaking of oxen, they needed to eat too, and there was almost no fresh grass left. The hay rotted under the constant downpours, leaving the animals on the brink of starvation. It was a classic domino effect, where one problem instantly triggered a whole chain of other disasters. And the scariest thing was that no one knew how to stop this process of total destruction. Have you ever tried to dry clothes in an apartment where the heat has been turned off and the window is constantly open? In the Middle Ages, all of Europe turned into such a damp and unbearably cold apartment. Salt, which was the main and only preservative of the time, simply stopped working. Due to high humidity, it dissolved and ran off the meat, leaving it to rot on hooks. Without salt, it was physically impossible to preserve any protein-rich foods for the winter. Modern freezing technologies would solve this problem in a second, but back then, they simply didn't exist. Cities, which usually depended on regular supplies from the countryside, found themselves completely cut off. Muddy roads made any logistics an absolutely impossible task. Even for experienced merchants, heavy carts loaded with food simply sank into the mud halfway to the city gates. Imagine a modern metropolis where food trucks suddenly stopped coming in. Panic would set in after 3 days, and within a week, the city would descend into primal chaos. In the Middle Ages, this chaos stretched on for long, agonizing months with no hope of rescue. At that point, governments tried to intervene and impose strict price controls. Kings issued stern decrees prohibiting the sale of grain above a certain price. How well do you think this worked in practice amid the panic? Spoiler, it didn't work at all, but only made an already desperate situation much worse. Merchants simply hid their remaining food and began selling it on the black market. Economic laws operate with the same ruthlessness, whether in the 21st century or the 14th. And so, burdened by such a heavy load of problems, Europe approached the onset of the real winter. The vast majority of people lacked proper food, dry firewood, and warm clothing. Their bodies were already exhausted by months of malnutrition and constant, devastating stress. Ahead of them lay the longest, darkest, and coldest months of their lives. Many intuitively understood that they simply would not survive until the following spring. The winter of 1315 became not just a season, but a true test of survival. The economics of famine is a shockingly brutal and incredibly predictable phenomenon. As soon as basic food becomes scarce, prices skyrocket at an incredible rate. By midwinter, the price of ordinary wheat had risen by nearly 300%. It's as if a standard loaf of bread at your local store suddenly cost $100. Most ordinary people simply couldn't afford such insane, unreasonable expenses. Their modest savings would last at most a couple of weeks under such crazy inflation. Why did ordinary bread become an absolute luxury, available only to the very select few? Because in the medieval diet, grain provided up to 80% of all calories consumed. Take away the bread, and you'd have to eat a gigantic mountain of meat to get the same energy. But the paradox was that meat and vegetables were no longer available either. The system had broken down at its very foundation, depriving people of a basic, cheap source of survival. Grain suddenly became the hardest currency, more reliable than gold and silver coins. In large cities, things began to happen that would seem utterly barbaric to a modern person. Cunning bakers mixed the pitiful remnants of normal flour with completely inedible additives. Fine sawdust, dry clay, and even chalk ground into powder were actively used. Sounds like a recipe for mortar, not a nutritious meal, right? But people bought even such substitutes because an empty stomach demanded at least some kind of filling. This gave a false sense of fullness, but did absolutely nothing to provide the exhausted body with the calories it needed. Now let's think about how consistently and ruthlessly medieval taxes worked. Local lords and the church demanded their share of the harvest, despite catastrophic weather conditions. They took the last grain from the peasants, citing ancient laws and feudal contracts.
We'll be all right, won't we?
Your modern tax office at least offers small discounts during a global crisis. Medieval tax collectors simply arrived with armed guards and took away your chances of survival. This inevitably sparked mass riots, which were suppressed by the authorities with incredible brutality. Monasteries, which traditionally and systematically helped the poor, also found themselves in a desperate situation. Crowds of frenzied, starving people stormed their sturdy gates daily, begging for alms. But first, the monks handed out hot soup and bread, faithfully fulfilling their Christian duty. Soon their own vast reserves began to rapidly and alarmingly run out. They had to shut the gates tight, leaving thousands of people to die slowly right beneath the stone walls. It was a morally difficult decision, but the math of survival knows no mercy. In this economic catastrophe, wage earners suffered the most and the fastest. Their daily wages remained the same, while food prices rose uncontrollably every day. A skilled blacksmith or carpenter could work hard from dawn to dusk, but there wasn't enough money for dinner. This is very similar to a modern severe economic crisis, only with mass fatalities. Your skilled labor suddenly becomes worthless because you cannot produce calories, and no professional skills will save you if there is simply no flour on the market. By the middle of the long winter, metal money had completely lost its original meaning and value. Cautious peasants flatly refused to sell their hidden grain for shiny silver coins. You can't boil silver in an iron cauldron and feed the resulting broth to your starving family. Europe quickly reverted to primitive barter, where edible calories were the sole measure of success. A wealthy merchant with a heavy chest of gold could very easily starve to death on a snow-covered road. That year's inflation proved a simple truth. True wealth is a full stomach.
Take this. Almost ready, children.
When normal human food ran out, people began actively experimenting with their menus. And believe me, you definitely wouldn't want to try these culinary experiments, even out of curiosity. First to be used was ordinary tree bark, especially the tough oak and birch varieties. They boiled it for hours in boiling water to make it at least a little softer and remove the acrid bitterness. The human stomach isn't designed to digest wood, so such a meal caused terrible internal pain. But it created the illusion of fullness, which purely psychologically helped cope with the growing panic. Then it was the pet's turn, and this was an incredibly difficult, far from easy choice. Eating a dog or a cat meant permanently depriving your home of protection against hordes of aggressive rats. And rats, as we know all too well from history, were the primary carriers of terrible epidemic diseases. But when your children are screaming from hunger, you don't think about the long-term health consequences. Everything that had 4 legs, fur, and could move was thrown into the boiling cauldrons. The streets of medieval cities quickly emptied, having lost their usual tailed inhabitants.
I'm so scared.
Human biology dictates very strict and uncompromising rules for survival during a calorie deficit. When the body doesn't receive energy from outside sources, it begins to literally devour itself from within. First, all body fat is burned, leaving a person completely defenseless against the winter cold. Then, the panicking body turns on the muscles, even breaking down the tissues of vital internal organs. The heart muscle rapidly weakens, and the pulse slows to critically low levels. People were turning into living skeletons right before our eyes, barely able to move. Imagine that your body is a modern smartphone with 1% battery life. It urgently shuts down all background apps to conserve energy for the most important basic functions. In the human body, this extreme energy-saving mode manifested as constant, severe apathy and drowsiness. People would lie down in their cold beds and simply didn't want to and couldn't get up anymore. Any active movement burned precious calories, so immobility seemed like the best biological strategy. Many quietly fell asleep on cold winter nights and never opened their eyes again. Young children fared the worst in this situation for entirely understandable physiological reasons. A growing body requires a tremendous amount of energy, building proteins and vitamins every day. Without protein, the growth of children's bones quickly stopped, causing severe and irreversible skeletal deformities. The infant mortality rate that winter shattered every conceivable historical record. If a child was born in 1315, statistically, they had almost no chance of survival. It sounds incredibly cruel, but it was the everyday, routine reality of the medieval crisis. In utter desperation, some peasants tried to make flatbread from dried bird droppings. They would wash it in water for a long time, hoping to find undigested whole grains of wheat or millet. This incredibly humiliating activity reveals the true depth of human degradation and despair. When social pride completely vanishes, only the basic, primal animal instinct for survival remains. It is simply impossible for a modern person who casually tosses an uneaten burger into the trash to understand such a mindset. For those emaciated people, every dirty seed they found meant a few more hours of life. By the frosty month of February, absolutely all alternative food sources had been nearly exhausted. The vast forests stood empty. Not a single stray dog, not even the skinniest one, remained in the cities. The rough bark on the trees had been neatly stripped away up to human height everywhere. People sat quietly in their cold huts, staring hopelessly into empty, soot-stained cauldrons. The diet of desperation had reached its logical and terrifying, deadly conclusion. The very moment had come when the most terrible decisions of their lives had to be made. We're used to thinking that the main enemy of humans in winter is always the bitter cold. But in 1315, the cold was only half of a huge, deadly problem. The real silent killer was the incredible, bone-chilling dampness that permeated absolutely everything around them. The endless rains that fell all summer turned into icy slush and wet snow in the fall. Your clothes never dried completely, remaining unpleasantly damp and cold to the touch. And wet fabric draws heat away from the human body 25 times faster than dry fabric. Imagine walking for a long time in the cold rain and then stepping into an industrial freezer. That's roughly what daily life felt like in a typical medieval village during that endless winter. It was impossible to keep the house warm because the firewood you'd gathered was soaked through as well. Building a good fire from damp branches is an extremely difficult task, even for an experienced survival expert. Such a fire produced far more acrid, thick smoke than actual life-saving heat. People sat for hours around smouldering hearths, coughing and shivering uncontrollably from the icy draft.
cold.
Modern survival science
so
tells us
hard
that
to
hypothermia is an incredibly insidious enemy. You don't have to be out in 30-degree freezing weather to quickly freeze to death. Temperatures just above freezing, combined with high humidity, can kill a person very quickly. An exhausted, starving body simply cannot generate enough internal heat to resist the environment. Without calories, your body's internal biological furnaces simply shut down one by one. A person falls into a state of thermal shock even while inside their own home. The everyday winter clothing of a medieval peasant was incredibly far from thermodynamic perfection. They had no lightweight jackets made of membrane fabric or high-tech thermal sports underwear. Their main protection consisted of heavy layers of coarse wool and linen, which instantly got soaked by the snow. If you happened to step into a deep puddle, your leather boots would stay wet until spring. Frozen, wet feet are the very first and surest step towards serious systemic illnesses. My toes start to ache just thinking about such a winter walk. Any work outdoors in such extreme conditions instantly turned into a real ordeal. But poor peasants couldn't just stay in a warm bed for days on end. They had to chop damp firewood, carry water, and search for at least some food every day. Every brief trip outside the house drained an enormous, irreplaceable amount of precious energy. Modern polar explorers burned thousands of calories a day just to maintain basic body heat. Medieval people simply did not have those spare calories available. Winter dirt roads in the Middle Ages were not of the highest quality, even in the best of times. And after many months of heavy rain, they simply ceased to exist as viable transportation routes. Any desperate attempt to walk to a neighboring village for help could easily have been one's last. Weakened travelers got stuck in freezing mud and fell into deep pits hidden beneath icy water. There were no rescue helicopters back then, nor were there emergency hotlines. If you were stranded on a deserted winter road in the 14th century, you would remain there forever. It is very important to understand the psychological aspect of this endless, depressing winter trap. In winter, daylight hours were very short, and people spent most of their time in complete darkness. Candles made from animal fat were a luxury that was now much more useful to eat than to burn. Constant darkness, biting cold, and empty stomachs caused the deepest clinical depression. Modern psychologists call this seasonal affective disorder, multiplied by 1,000. People simply lost the will to resist and surrendered to the encroaching cold darkness. Thus, the winter climate trap closed in from all sides at exactly the same time. The cold stiffened the joints, the dampness penetrated right into the bones, and the darkness drove people mad. The body, severely weakened by months of starvation, could not resist this hostile environment for long. It was a perfect storm of negative factors, each of which was already deadly on its own. Nature methodically and mercilessly tested humanity's resilience in the cruelest ways, and the overwhelming majority of people failed this harsh test of survival with a resounding crash. Let's take a close look at what a typical residential home looked like during those harsh times. Today, we complain bitterly if modern plastic windows let in even a slight draft. In the Middle Ages, real window glass was an incredibly expensive and rare luxury reserved for the wealthy. In the homes of ordinary peasants, there were simply square holes in the walls, covered with rough wooden shutters. During the day, these shutters had to be opened to let at least some light into the gloomy room. Along with the light, the icy winter wind and stinging snow instantly rushed inside. Sounds like an absolute architectural disaster, doesn't it? But there's one important detail that makes the situation even more ridiculous and absurd. Most peasant homes of that period didn't even have a proper stone chimney. Your modern engineered chimney does an excellent job of venting dangerous gases outside. In the 14th century, an open fire was lit right on the earthen floor in the center of the main room. All the acrid smoke was supposed to escape through a special opening in the thatched roof. The main problem was that in windy or rainy weather, the smoke refused to rise. It quickly filled the entire living room with a thick, incredibly suffocating grey haze. people had to sit on the floor constantly just to be able to breathe normally. Their eyes constantly watered, and their lungs filled with the toxic fumes from burning damp wood. It was like locking yourself in a small garage with the engine of an old diesel car running. A chronic cough was an inevitable occupational hazard for every medieval person trying to survive. The walls of such simple houses were usually made of wooden wattle, densely coated with clay mixed with straw. Under normal, dry conditions, this composite material did a decent job of retaining heat inside the room. But due to the constant summer rains, the clay became soggy and began to fall off in huge chunks. The walls literally dissolved before our eyes, forming huge cracks through which the wind blew. Repairing them in the middle of winter with frozen mud was a physically impossible and pointless task. The houses were rapidly turning into sieves that could not protect against even a light draft. The floor in such primitive dwellings was earthen and covered with a thick layer of dry reeds. But the ground moisture from below quickly turned this floor into a rotting, slimy, and cold mess. Sleeping on such a damp surface was like sleeping for a long time in an icy swamp. Not every peasant family had real beds on high wooden legs. Most people slept right on the floor, covered with old animal skins and dirty rags. This was a surefire way to develop severe rheumatism and pneumonia in a matter of days. It was interesting to observe how people tried to modify their crumbling homes to survive. They tightly plugged the cracks in the walls with dry forest moss and old, unwanted rags. They hung thick layers of fabric over the doors, creating a sort of insulated vestibule. This is a fundamental principle of insulation that is still successfully applied in modern construction.
Hello.
The air gap between the layers of fabric acted as an effective thermal barrier. The peasants knew nothing about physics, but intuitively understood the laws of heat conservation perfectly. As a result, the traditional medieval house transformed from a reliable fortress into a deadly trap. It could no longer keep people warm, nor could it protect them from aggressive dampness and new diseases. People expended enormous daily effort simply to maintain a temperature just above freezing. The struggle for a few degrees of warmth was just as exhausting as the endless struggle for food, and often it was a severe cold caught in one's own home that proved fatal. Drafty, windowless houses became silent witnesses to thousands of lives lost to the cold. When we talk about deadly famine, we often forget about its invisible companion. This silent companion killed far more people than the mere lack of calories itself. I am talking about the total, systemic collapse of the immune system of the entire population of Europe. Modern medicine knows for certain that a healthy gut plays a key role in immunity, and when only rotten crusts enter the gut, the defense system suffers a critical failure. Your exhausted body literally opens all doors to any passing infection. Diseases began to spread at a terrifying speed, simply unimaginable for that time. Severe pneumonia became the absolute and unquestionable leading cause of death that winter. Weakened lungs, irritated by the constant acrid smoke from bonfires, could not resist the bacteria. Add to this the freezing dampness in homes, and you have the perfect incubator for disease. Today, we easily treat pneumonia with a simple course of antibiotics over a couple of comfortable weeks. Back then, it was a 100% certain, guaranteed, and excruciating death sentence for everyone. But here's what's truly striking about the dry medical records of that grim time. Diseases that people had begun to forget started returning en masse and with a vengeance. Dysentery decimated entire villages due to the forced consumption of spoiled food and dirty water. Desperate people drank from puddles and melted snow mixed with mud and filth. Intestinal infections dehydrated, weakened bodies in a matter of days, robbing them of their last strength. Death from severe dehydration amid endless rains sounds like a cruel twist of fate. Scurvy, which we usually associate exclusively with sailors, became a widespread problem among peasants. Without fresh summer vegetables and fruits, vitamin C levels in their bodies dropped to zero. People's gums began to bleed profusely, and perfectly healthy, strong teeth started falling out. Old, long-healed scars and wounds suddenly reopened and began to bleed anew. This sounds like a gruesome scene from a horror movie, but it is a dry, documented medical fact. Collagen ceased to be synthesized, and the human body literally, physically fell apart. Medieval doctors proved absolutely and utterly useless in the face of this catastrophe. Their cutting-edge treatments included copious bloodletting and the application of hungry leeches. Imagine you're emaciated, you have no strength left, and a clever doctor drains you of your last drop of blood. This is the most brilliant solution to guarantee the quick and certain demise of a sick patient. Medicine at the time was foolishly based on the ancient theory of humors and fluid balance, and they sincerely believed that ridding the body of bad blood would somehow cure cellular starvation. Skin infections became yet another real, itchy nightmare of that era. The complete lack of proper hygiene and clean hot water led to outbreaks of scabies. Skin immunity plummeted, and any minor scratch instantly turned into a festering sore. People were completely covered in sores that wouldn't heal for months on end due to a lack of protein. Imagine that every random cut on your finger hurts and festers for 6 months. Now add to that coarse, unwashed woolen clothing that constantly rubs against open wounds. This hellish cocktail of hunger and disease created an unprecedented demographic crisis. People were dying en masse, not only because they literally had nothing to put in their mouths. They were dying because their emaciated bodies had simply forgotten how to defend themselves against germs. Viruses and bacteria successfully finished what the endless rainy weather had started. Europe's herd immunity was completely destroyed, leaving the population utterly defenseless, and this collapse of immunity prepared the perfect ground for future, even more terrifying catastrophes. And so we have come to the darkest, most gruesome, and most terrifying part of this historical drama. When the bitter bark is gone, when all the dogs and rotten leather straps have been eaten, the limit is reached. Human morality is a very thin veneer of civilization that is easily washed away by severe hunger. In the year 1315, this fragile veneer burst with a crack across all of Europe. People began to view one another not as kind neighbors, but as walking sources of protein. And this is not an exaggeration from scary fairy tales, but harsh, documented court records. Sounds wild, doesn't it? But let's take a cold, hard look at the psychology of a person driven to absolute, animalistic desperation. When the brain is completely deprived of glucose for a long time, irreversible processes begin. The centers responsible for empathy and social norms simply shut down to conserve energy. In their place emerges the ancient reptilian brain, which has only one primitive task: to survive. The rational, civilized human disappears, leaving in its place a very hungry and dangerous predator. The chronicles of that time are literally replete with gruesome court records and eyewitness accounts. In Ireland, official documents have survived, detailing how prisoners in jails ate new arrivals. Imagine a dark cell where guards throw a newcomer straight into the hands of a frenzied mob. It sounds like the plot of the most brutal and gory R-rated horror movie. But for the authorities of the time, it was simply a convenient solution to prison overcrowding. The guards didn't have to spend money feeding the prisoners. The prisoners took care of that themselves. But the most terrifying and incomprehensible events did not take place in filthy prisons, but in ordinary villages. There are absolutely reliable records of how frenzied parents killed their own children. This idea is so monstrous that the modern mind categorically refuses to accept it. However, the primal logic of survival in conditions of total chaos can be incredibly cruel. To save their own lives, adults hope to one day give birth to new children in better times. The instinct for self-preservation ruthlessly rewrote the basic laws of motherhood and fatherhood. The corpses of deceased relatives also instantly ceased to be merely sacred objects for burial. On dark nights, in secret from suspicious neighbors, fresh graves were regularly dug up. Meat was carefully cut from the thighs and arms, salted with the remaining salt, and boiled in a stew. Local priests tried to guard the cemeteries, but the hungry, frenzied crowd swept aside any obstacles. A modern, well-fed society would immediately faint at the mere sight of such meat soup. But back then, it was simply called a difficult decision to save what remained of a surviving family. It was during this horrific historical period that the famous fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel was born. We've been accustomed since childhood to think of it as just a fun story about a wicked witch and a gingerbread house. But the true historical basis of this fairy tale is thoroughly steeped in the horror of the year 1315. Desperate parents did indeed take their children deep into the forest and leave them there forever. They simply could not bear to watch their children slowly and painfully starve to death at home. And the cannibal witch is a collective metaphorical image of the real mad people of that time. A completely new type of criminal activity even emerged: the hunting of lone, defenseless travelers. Gangs of brutal deserters and impoverished peasants hid in the bushes along forest roads. They killed passers-by not for gold or silver, which had completely lost their value. They specifically hunted for human flesh, which had become the most sought-after resource. The medieval forest serial killer did not suffer from complex psychological trauma stemming from a difficult childhood. He simply wanted a hearty dinner and to survive until the next snowy winter morning. This dark chapter of history teaches us a very important and unpleasant sociological lesson. Our civilization survives only as long as there is at least a little food on the shelves. Take away basic food resources for a couple of months, and society will instantly revert to the Stone Age. People who had just been building magnificent Gothic cathedrals turned into bloodthirsty monsters. The winter of 1315 brutally ripped the mask of nobility from humanity, and beneath that mask lay the bestial snarl of absolute, unprincipled, and brutal survival. You might logically assume that the wealthy lords sat in their castles and laughed at the poor. That is usually how it goes in human history. Whoever has the most money survives. But the Great Famine proved surprisingly democratic and fair in its destruction. The huge royal entourage was accustomed to lavish feasts with dozens of courses of exquisite dishes. But upon arrival, it turned out that they literally could not even find bread for the king's entourage. The powerful ruler of an entire country sat at an empty table, like the poorest peasant. It was the moment when the feudal system revealed its absolute and total failure. Why did these powerful lords find themselves in such a ridiculous, humiliating, and dangerous situation? Because their wealth was based solely on agricultural taxes and the labor of others. A lord did not know how to grow wheat in a field or catch fish in a cold river. His social role consisted of governance and warfare, not the production of edible calories. When the peasants stopped bringing in the harvest, the lords found themselves completely cut off from their source of sustenance. Their beautiful castles were full of weapons and armor, but the storehouses stood completely empty. Imagine a modern, influential billionaire who finds himself on a deserted island with a briefcase full of money. His offshore bank accounts are enormous, but he can't even buy a bottle of fresh water. That is exactly how the proud medieval barons felt during the cold winter of that dreadful year. They desperately sent armed detachments to the villages to forcibly take whatever food remained. But the strong soldiers returned empty-handed because there was absolutely nothing to take. You cannot take bread from someone who has been living on nothing but birch bark for a week. Maintaining a large castle required enormous daily expenditures of resources and fresh provisions. A typical castle housed hundreds of people, numerous servants, guards, blacksmiths, and stable hands. This entire massive army of dependents had to be fed heartily every single day. When supplies ran completely dry, the lords were forced to lay off their loyal servants en masse. This created huge crowds of very hungry and angry men with real military experience. Former guards banded together and began mercilessly plundering the lands of their own former masters. For a knight, a thoroughbred horse was not merely a means of transportation, but the primary, sacred symbol of status. A war horse cost a fortune and required select oats to maintain its physical condition. But feeding a horse with precious grain while your children were dying of hunger was impossible. Proud knights had to slaughter their elite war horses with tears in their eyes. It was like cutting up an expensive collectible sports car into scrap metal. Without horses, the knightly class instantly lost its main military advantage over the mob. Attempts to organize food imports from other countries also failed spectacularly. Merchant ships carrying precious grain from the Mediterranean were easily intercepted by pirates, and the rare ships that made it to port were attacked by frenzied, starving mobs. Even the armed royal guard could not stop thousands of people driven aggressive by hunger. The valuable cargo was looted right on the pier within minutes of docking. High-level state logistics simply crumbled against the harsh reality of mass despair. The church, composed of very wealthy bishops, also lost a huge portion of its influence. Mass prayers for an end to the rains clearly did not work, despite all the solemn processions. The fat bishops, who had previously preached moderation, began to rapidly lose weight before everyone's eyes. Heavy golden crosses and richly decorated altars could not produce a single gram of flour. People began quietly asking very dangerous questions about the meaning of constant church donations. Why give a tithe to the Almighty God if He allows His devoted children to suffer so? In the end, this famine proved to be the great equalizer of the entire stratified medieval society. It paid no heed to family lineage, coats of arms on shields, or the amount of gold in the cellar. In the face of an empty wooden plate, the duke and the humble swineherd were absolutely equal. Biology makes no allowances for social status or fine, expensive clothing. The stomach of an arrogant aristocrat cramped with pain just as much as that of a peasant. And that winter proved to everyone that all human greatness is incredibly, terrifyingly fragile.
Sun returns to us.
Finally, let's take a close look at the long-term historical consequences of this icy nightmare. The Great Famine officially ended by the year 1317, when the weather returned to normal. The survivors breathed a sigh of relief, sincerely believing that the worst was behind them. But they were cruelly and tragically mistaken, because this was merely a rehearsal for the apocalypse. The famine did not merely kill millions of people, it fundamentally altered the biology of all the survivors. The bodies of an entire generation were permanently broken and completely stripped of their natural reserves. The children who miraculously survived those terrible years grew up with serious chronic conditions. Their height was significantly below average, their bones were brittle, and their immune systems were practically non-existent. Modern epigenetics proves that prolonged, severe stress alters the expression of human genes. The bodies of such people function in emergency energy-saving mode for the rest of their lives. They were living, walking targets for any, even the most minor, seasonal infection. It was this generation of physically weakened people that came of age by the mid-14th century. After the famine, European villages resembled the bleak sets of a post-apocalyptic film. A third of all fertile farmland lay abandoned due to an acute labor shortage. It took decades of hard work to fully restore the livestock population. Europe's economy was set back a full century in its technological development. No innovations in agriculture could quickly compensate for the loss of human capital. The remaining peasants worked themselves to the bone just to feed their small families. But there is one very unexpected, paradoxical economic detail for the survivors. Those who did not die suddenly found themselves in a very advantageous position in the labor market. Previously, there were too many peasants, and the lords paid them mere pennies for their work. Now, however, there was a catastrophic shortage of strong laborers on every feudal estate. Your physical labor suddenly became a scarce commodity for which lords were willing to compete fiercely. Today, your office job requires a degree, but back then, a simple peasant could dictate terms to a baron. This led to an unprecedented rise in wages and the gradual dismantling of serfdom. People began moving much more actively between regions in search of a better, more prosperous life. Why work hard for a greedy lord when the neighboring baron offers twice as much grain? Social mobility, which had previously seemed like an impossible fantasy, became the new norm of life. It was a very bitter victory, bought at the cost of millions of neighbors who died of starvation. Capitalism began to take its very first tentative roots in soil generously fertilized with bones. However, cruel nature was preparing a new, even more devastating blow to this fragile society. Europe was a vast continent, densely populated by people with compromised health. Filthy cities were once again becoming overcrowded, and sanitary conditions had not improved. It was a perfectly primed, vast, dry forest, meekly awaiting a single spark. And that deadly spark arrived on merchant ships from the east just a couple of decades later. I am speaking of the Great Black Death, the bubonic plague of 1347. Epidemiologists still debate why the plague killed so many people in Europe. Nearly half the continent's population rapidly perished over a few terrible, nightmarish years, and the secret lies precisely in the direct consequences of the Great Famine, which we are discussing today. The immune systems of Europeans were so depleted by a diet of tree bark that they could not fight back. The plague bacterium simply encountered absolutely no biological resistance in people's bodies. The plague became the coup de grace to an already defeated and severely weakened enemy. Had the Great Famine not occurred, mortality from the plague could have been significantly lower. A healthy, well-fed body with a normal supply of vitamins has a good chance of overcoming the disease. But the people of the 14th century were completely deprived of this protective barrier from childhood onward. History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, but the biological connections here are absolutely and crystal clear. One catastrophic climatic event neatly laid out the red carpet for another. This is a brilliant example of how complex cascading catastrophes work in human history. The deep psychological trauma from these events forever changed European culture. A popular genre called the Dance of Death emerged in art, where cheerful skeletons danced with living people. Death came to be perceived not as a distant prospect, but as a constant, intrusive roommate. Gloomy Gothic aesthetics and a strong emphasis on physical suffering became the foundation of the worldview of that era. People became acutely aware of their absolute insignificance in the face of the forces of merciless nature, and this clinging fear remained in the collective unconscious for many centuries to come. By studying this period, we now understand one very simple and sobering truth. Our modern technologies give us only a false sense of complete safety and control. We naively believe that the climate and nature are completely under our control. But in reality, only a few consecutive years of good harvests separate us from chaos. Disrupt the supply chain, remove food from supermarket shelves for 6 months, and the magic of civilization will vanish. We are still the same people who would be ready to gnaw on tree bark if we were backed into a corner.
They will pay.
Life in the year 1315 was a real, brutal lottery where the odds were stacked against you. It was not a romantic, beautiful time of knightly tournaments and fair ladies in high towers. It was cold mud, endless pouring rain, an empty stomach, and an icy wind at your back. It was far from the strongest, the richest, and certainly not the most noble who survived. Those who survived were the ones whose bodies miraculously managed to genetically adapt to the complete absence of basic resources. It is difficult for modern people to even imagine such superhuman endurance, let alone attempt to replicate it. The next time you complain bitterly about the bad weather outside your window, remember this story. Remember that your hot morning coffee and warm radiator are the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. We built this incredibly comfortable world literally on the bones of those who froze in straw huts. Their agonizing suffering served as a harsh lesson that compelled humanity to advance science and agriculture. I hope this deep dive into the dark past has made you appreciate your hearty dinner a little more today. Like this post if you're genuinely glad to have been born in the age of supermarkets, and subscribe to learn even more secrets of history.